So we're first going to start off by looking at some of the benefits of critical thinking. And now we'll be using capital C, capital T as shorthand for critical thinking throughout the rest of this semester. So critical thinking skills, they allow you to provide good reasons for a position. It will help you learn how to make good arguments. So, whatever major you might have, you'll be trying to draw conclusions based on reasons, based on evidence, based on a proof. Those are premises, those are reasons or evidence that counts in favor of a particular kind of conclusion. And what the common denominator is amongst all the various subject matters in the university is logic. Logic underlies all of these various subject matters, and that logic is the study of how we know when an argument is good and when and how do we know that an argument is bad. So in your classes, when you're trying to draw conclusions on a particular issue, it could be, let's say, running experiments in a science class or doing readings, trying to, let's say, draw a conclusion in history as far as what started World War II, you'll be using logic. And logic will determine whether or not your conclusion is a good one or if it's a bad one. Critical thinking also teaches you how to evaluate arguments as being good or bad. They teach you how to evaluate other people's arguments. So, for example, in the ordinary real world, you may get in an argument with your roommate or maybe your siblings or your parents. You may be watching a sports TV show where people are debating about what team is going to win the championship, or watching an entertainment show about who's going to win the Oscars, or maybe a political show in which people are debating about politics. In all of those kinds of cases, you are being presented with arguments, and people are attempting to use logic in order to arrive upon their conclusions. And in this class, you will learn how to assess all these various arguments that you encounter in the world. And also in your studies and in your professional life out after the university, you will be presented with other people's arguments, and you'll have to construct your own arguments as well. And once again, underlying all of that is logic. And so this course will help you in a wide variety of different kinds of issues that will present themselves to you in your lifetime. Critical thinking allows you to connect facts and put them together to form arguments. For example, let's say you're a juror in a criminal trial. You might be presented with a variety of facts. Maybe facts against against someone, as well as facts maybe in support of that person. And then you have to be able to connect the dots and connect all the facts together, and then weigh where the evidence lies, right, in order to draw the proper kind of conclusion from the evidence. Well, critical thinking teaches you and allows you to learn how to connect these facts and weigh the various evidence that can come your way. And this means having these skills mean that you're more likely to have true rather than false beliefs. So if your beliefs are justified properly, then you're more likely to have true beliefs rather than false beliefs. If you completely have the antithesis or the opposite of critical thinking skills, you're more likely to have false beliefs because you will not be properly have the proper kind of justification for your beliefs. And throughout this semester also, I'll be using capital T as shorthand for true and capital F as shorthand for false. And notice that critical thinking very much is different from coin flipping and astrology. For example, in coin flipping, if you need to make a decision, but you just flip a coin, heads or tails, in order to make your decision, that's just based on random chance, right? Based on luck as far as what comes out of it. However, with critical thinking, when you make a decision, it will not be like a coin flip, but rather your decision will be based on evidence, based on proof, based on reasons. Okay, so let's look at some basic concepts of critical thinking. The first concept is an argument. An argument is an attempt to provide reasons for thinking that some belief is true. So if you notice with an argument that it contains several components, there are reasons or evidence put in favor of a particular belief, where the idea here in presenting as an argument is trying to show that that particular belief is true. So we can look at more closely at these components of an argument. The two components of an argument are the premises and the conclusion. And premises are statements that support or provide evidence or reasons in favor of a belief or conclusion. They are what is used to support a conclusion and to try to convince other people to accept a particular conclusion. It could be the case that an argument only has one premise, but in many cases arguments can have two or more premises. Next component of an argument is a conclusion. The conclusion is a statement that is supported by the premises. It is the kind of end result that is itself buttressed by or supported by the premises, where the premises provide reasons in favor of the conclusion. So we see here that there are two parts of an argument. Remember, an argument is an attempt to provide reasons for thinking that some belief is true. Well, those reasons are the premises. And for thinking that some belief is true, that belief is the conclusion. So at minimum in an argument, you must have at least one premise and one conclusion in order to have an argument. Okay, so next let's look at statements, questions, and commands. Premises and conclusions, they are statements. What are statements? Well, statements are capable of being true or false. Statements are propositions that are capable of being true or false. For example, the statement that George Washington is the first president of the United States, that is capable of being true or false. And in this case, it happens to be true. Abraham Lincoln is the first president of the United States. That is also a statement because it is capable of being true or false. In this case, it is false. And it's important that premises and conclusions are statements because we want our conclusion to be capable of being true or false. That's why we're presenting an argument. We're providing reasons in favor of the conclusion to try to justify that the conclusion is true or false. The premises must also be capable of being true or false as well. Right? If we're providing evidence in favor of a conclusion, well then that evidence better be capable of being true or false. And if you have a good argument, which is what you should try to strive for, those premises should be true. So it very much should be the case that premises and conclusions are statements. However, questions and commands all by themselves are not statements. So I can raise a question such as, is it raining outside? What just came out of my mouth? Is it raining outside? That in itself is not capable of being true or false of the world. At least not in the same way that George Washington is the first president of the United States is capable of being true or false. George Washington is the first president of the United States. That utterance is capable of being true or false based on history, right? So therefore it is a statement. However, questions like, is it raining outside? That in and of itself is not capable of being true or false of the world. We can't look to the world to see if that question is itself, in and of itself, true. Now, there can be an answer to the question, such as, no, it is not raining outside, and the answer to the question is capable of being true or false, right? We can look outside our window to see whether or not it's raining outside, and that will determine whether or not the answer to the question is true or false. But the question itself, is it raining outside, is not capable of being true or false. Also, commands by themselves, by their lonesome, commands, they are not capable of being true or false. For example, if I, let's say, am at a Carolina Panthers football game and I yell, "Go Panthers," that's a command, but "Go Panthers," that is not capable of being true or false of the world. Right? Not in the same way George Washington is the first president of the United States is capable of being true or false. So what we can see here is that questions and commands are not statements. So therefore, they cannot be contained they cannot be premises or conclusions of an argument, at least not when considered by their lonesome. However, sometimes questions and commands can be rewritten to form statements within the context of an argument. So a question or command might be given within a passage, and given the context of the entire passage, the question or command may implicitly be providing a statement, where that implicit statement within the question or command could be a premise or it could be a conclusion. To give you an example, let's say there's this passage that's something like this. Can you believe what that company just did? They polluted the air and they polluted the water of the local residents in order to make a higher profit. All right, so that passage that I just uttered, the first part of that passage was a question. Can you believe what this company just did? However, implicit within that question is a statement. It's a statement that this company is unethical. And we can kind of gather that that question itself contains an implicit statement based on the context of the passage, where the rest of that passage are the premises for that statement. For example, this company polluted the air and the water of the local community. And so, therefore, we have the implied statement within the question, this company is unethical. So what we see here in this example passage is that the question implicit within it was a statement, where the statement itself is the conclusion of the passage. Okay, now let's make a distinction between statements versus sentences. So statements, they are not necessarily the same thing as sentences. And maybe some of you might be thinking that's true, because you can have a question question can be a sentence, but it's not a statement. Now, whether something is a sentence is determined by whether it follows the rules of grammar. A sentence, however, can contain two statements. Go ahead, try to think of yourself of one sentence that itself contains two statements. For example, to give you one example, there's one sentence here. Jack and Jill both hit a home run in the game. What came out of my mouth was one sentence. However, that one sentence contained two statements. There's a statement that Jack hit a home run in the game, and the second statement is that Jill hit a home run in the game. Both of those are statements because they're both capable of being true or false independent of each other. Right? It could be the case that Jack hit a home run but Jill didn't. So there's one statement that's false and the other statement is correct. And that could also be switched around. Right? It could be the case that Jill hit a home run and Jack did not. So therefore, the statement that Jill hit a home run is true, and the statement that Jack hit a home run is false. But they're both two statements that are independently capable of being true or false. That is, independent of each other. There also can possibly be two or more sentences that may contain only one statement. So this is a little bit trickier, but here's one example of that. Let me give you two sentences. One sentence is that Jack is a bachelor. The second sentence is that Jack is an unmarried man. I just gave you two sentences, but there's only one statement. And that's because being a bachelor and being an unmarried man mean the same thing. There's really only one thing that's capable of being true or false here. There's this one single person, Jack, and the question is whether he's a bachelor or whether he's an unmarried male. If he is a bachelor, then he is an unmarried male. If he's not a bachelor, then he is not an unmarried male. So we see here that both sentences are not capable of being independently true or false, but rather if one is true, the other one must be true. And if one is false, the other one also must be false. So what we have here is just one statement that's given in different ways by two different sentences. Now, being able to distinguish between statements and sentences, this is going to be important for finding the premises and conclusions of an argument. Because it could be the case that you have one sentence that itself contains a premise and a conclusion. It could be the case that you have an entire argument contained within just one sentence. And that's possible because there are words like and or that can connect various statements together. So you could have several statements in a particular sentence, but if you are confused and you understand one sentence to equal only one statement, then you might not think that there's an argument presented. Let's say if you're given an argument that's only one sentence long. So it's important to realize that a sentence may contain several statements. So for example, one sentence might contain an entire argument, or it might contain all the premises, or it might contain 4 premises, or it might contain just one premise and a conclusion, but there are other premises given in other statements that are contained within various sentences. So it's important to realize that there's not an exact one-to-one correspondence between statements and sentences. And this itself will help you to identify what the premises and conclusions are to an argument. Okay, so now there are 3 steps for seeing if there is an argument presented. So you'll be, for example, given passages where you have to determine whether or not there's an argument presented or not. One thing to look out for is to look for an attempt to convince. That's usually an indication that there's an argument being presented. If someone is trying to convince you of something, then they're usually trying to provide reasons or evidence, or in other words, premises, to try to convince you to believe a particular conclusion. A second step is to find the conclusion. If you can find the conclusion, well, this is the author's final main point, and this will help you look for the premises. So it actually, if you're given an exercise to find the conclusion and premises of a passage, in a lot of cases, it will help to find the conclusion first. Because once you find the conclusion, the premises are nothing but those statements that support the conclusion. Right? So that's all you have to look for in the passage, are those statements that end up supporting the conclusion. And once you find those are the premises. So if you can find a conclusion, and that can then help you find the premises, then you know that you have an argument before you. And on page 14 of your textbook, there are a variety of different kinds of indicator words. These are just a small subset of the various indicator words that are in your textbook. These are words such as therefore, so, thus, consequently, hence. So when you see these kinds of indicator words, usually, but not in all cases, but usually what follows these words is the conclusion. So these can also help you find the conclusion. A third step is to find the premises. Find the reasons why the arguer believes the conclusion. If you can find premises and they support a conclusion, well then the passage is an argument. And there are also indicator words for the premises. And there are many indicator words given on page 14 of your textbook, but here is a small example of some of these indicator words. There are words such as since, because, based on, as shown by. Usually, but not in all cases, but usually what follows after these indicator words is or are the premises. Okay, so with that, I'd like to go through some various example questions here of some of the things we've already discussed today. And this will help you get warmed up with the homework. The homework will contain questions that are somewhat along the lines of these kinds of questions that we'll be going through here in this video presentation. And if you want to pause the video so you can think about what the answer is to these questions, feel free to pause the video. So first exercise, we'll look at how many statements are in each sentence. So the first sentence is that Stephen walked to the store, bought a newspaper, and then went to a cafe to read it. Here, we have one sentence, but the answer to this question is that there are 3 statements contained within this single sentence. In other words, there are 3 statements that are capable of being true or false, independent of each other. The first statement is that Stephen walked to the store. The second one is that he bought a newspaper, And the third is that then he went to a cafe to read it. Those can all be independently true or false of each other. For example, it could be true that Stephen walked to the store, but it could be false that he bought a newspaper. And so here we have three statements. The second question, Mercury is composed mostly of hot gases. How many statements are in this sentence? Well, the answer to this is that there is only one statement here that's capable of being true or false. Just one statement here, Mercury is composed mostly of hot gases. Third, how many times must I play the fool? The answer to this is that there are no statements in this passage here. And that's because, remember, questions all by themselves do not contain any statements. Next, let's look at which sentences don't express a statement. For example, the first question here is that oxygen is an element. Does this sentence express a statement? The answer to this is that yes, it does express a statement because oxygen is an element that is capable of being true or false. Second, we have shine bright like a diamond, where this is a lyric from Diamonds, the song Diamonds by Rihanna. Does this express a statement? In and of itself, no, it does not, because it's a command. So this does not express a statement. Remember, commands do not express statements. Third, the earth revolves around the sun. This does express a statement. The earth revolves around the sun is capable of being true or false. Fourth, how long do you think it will rain? The answer to this, well, it's a question, right? So in and of itself, it is not a statement. Number 5, you might be at a game and you might yell, "Go Tigers!" That in and of itself is not capable of being true or false of the world in the same way as, for example, that George Washington is the first president of the United States is capable of being true or false. So this is a command, and so it does not express a statement. Next, identify the premises and conclusion. So here we have passages, and then you should then identify what is or are the premises and what's the conclusion. The first passage is this: every time you hang out with him, you feel miserable, so you shouldn't go out with him. Let's follow the method that we discussed before and find the conclusion first. The conclusion here, in other words, that statement that is being supported by other statements or by the premises, is that you shouldn't go out with him. And notice that there's a nice indicator word there, so, that precedes it, that precedes the conclusion. So the conclusion here is that you shouldn't go out with him. So once we find the conclusion, we then look for the premises. And remember, the premises are just nothing but those statements that support the conclusion. So what supports the statement that you shouldn't go out with him? Well, it's this: every time you hang out with him, you feel miserable. So that is the premise of the argument. Every time you hang out with him, you feel miserable. Second, I've seen 1,000 swans and all of them are white. Therefore, most swans are white. Let's find the conclusion first. If we notice here, there's a nice indicator word, therefore. So and we look, what follows after that, most swans are white. That indeed is the conclusion. And we also see that it is being supported by the previous passage there. I've seen 1,000 swans and all of them are white. Right? And we can break up that first sentence into two statements. I've seen 1,000 swans, and the second statement is all of them are white. So those are the two premises that end up supporting or providing reasons in favor of believing the conclusion that most swans are white. Third, how can anyone support gun control? Look at all the lives that have been saved because someone had a gun. And there's the economic benefits of gun sales. Do you want people who make guns to lose their jobs? So let's look for the conclusion first here. So when looking for the conclusion, once again, we're looking for a statement that is supported by other statements within the passage. It's what other statements in the passage are all kind of leading up towards, kind of what they all provide evidence or support for. And what we see here is that in the first sentence, which is a question, implicit within this question, given the context of a passage, is the conclusion. The question here, how can anyone support gun control? Right? That in and of itself, that in the context of this passage, implies a statement that you should not support gun control. What are the premises or evidence that supports that? Right? Once we found our conclusion, we just look for those passages that support that. Well, is that people's lives have been saved because someone had a gun. Right? That's one premise that helps support the conclusion that there should not be gun control. And there's another premise that there are economic benefits to gun sales, such as that it helps people keep their jobs, right, who are in the gun business. So here we have the conclusion, which in this case is implicit within the question, the first question.